Welcome. This is Penetrate Your Brain, the podcast, a Zombie Torres media production hosted by your favorite Mexican, Zombie Torres. The podcast where we penetrate your brain with knowledge and information about horror, the paranormal, true crime, current events, pop culture, the sex industry, and everything in between, and a whole lot more. I mean, gore. Some material may not be suitable for everyone. You have been warned. Enjoy.
Welcome to another episode of Penetrate Your Brain, the podcast. On today's episode, we will be talking about Gregorio Cardenas Hernandez The Tacuba Strangler.
The Strangler of Tacuba. Gregorio Cardenas Hernandez was a small, shy, 8-year-old boy with a tendency to look down whenever anyone talked to him. Gregorio, or Goyo for short, Goyo also suffered from severe health problems, which led to him one day defecating in his trousers in the middle of class. No one realized what had happened until the other students pointed out the smell. Little Goyo burst into tears as he laughed out loud and called them shit pants over and over again. His teacher looked irritated and ordered him out of the classroom. As Goyo got up with difficulty, as his soiled trousers were stuck to the chair, he stepped in his own excrement and smashed his forehead on the corner of a desk. No one, not even his teacher, tried to help Goyo get up. Instead, his classmates watched as he struggled back on his feet. With his eyes crunched up with pain, he stumbled out of the classroom sobbing. A few minutes later, another teacher heard Goyo crying in the toilet cubicle. He was too afraid to come out. His trousers were so badly soiled, he couldn't put them back on. The same teacher eventually persuaded Goyo to open the cubicle door, wrapped a towel around him, and escorted him along the busy school corridor as more school children poked fun at him. Goyo was ordered by the school's headmaster to wait outside his office until his mother picked him up. Goyo later recalled that no one else said another word to him as he sat there shivering in the flimsy towel. When Goyo's mother, Vicenta, finally arrived to pick him up, she seemed irritated. She hadn't even brought him a change of clothes, so he faced more humiliation as his mother pulled him along by the hand, back along the main school corridor towards the front exit of the school. Goyo later claimed that what happened that day at school in the 1920s was mainly his mother's fault. She'd been too ashamed to tell the school in the first place that her young son had a brain disease known as encephalitis, which meant he couldn't control his bowels. But it wasn't just at school where Goyo faced endless humiliation. On the streets of the Tacuba district of Mexico City, where he lived with his family, Goyo constantly felt people staring at him because of his extremely long, skinny arms and the fact that one of his legs was shorter than the other, which meant he had a distinct limp. From a young age, Goyo preferred reading and painting to playing with the other children. He had an extremely intelligent, analytical mind and lived more inside his own head than anywhere else. His mother, Vicenta Hernandez, was the only person in his life he should have had a close relationship with. However, she wasn't very loving towards him, rarely showing him affection, and was embarrassed by his physical appearance, that she'd often make him walk behind her when they were in public. Vicenta's relatives and friends later recalled that she snapped at Goyo much of the time and ordered him around as if he were a dog, rather than someone she gave birth to. But back home, away from the prying eyes of her rich friends and family, Vicenta insisted Goyo sleep in her bed when her husband was away on business, which occurred frequently. Goyo later claimed that his relationship with his mother was so suffocatingly inconsistent that he spent much of his time trying to avoid her, which meant being alone in his bedroom or in the backyard of the family's large, detached house, entertaining himself. Bored and curious about the world, Goyo became fascinated with death from a young age, and with no one to talk to about it, he devised his own unique experiments to satisfy that interest. It began by choking and strangling animals, including rabbits, mice, and rats, just to see how much these suffered when they were dying. He later recalled that he saw each death as the culmination of a scientific experiment. He felt no malice toward the animals themselves, but felt, to feed his own curiosity, he needed to take their lives. None of Goyo's other family members cared about the way he inflicted pain on innocent animals and then avidly watched them die. To them, he was just little Goyo, a strange, eccentric child. In the wake of the incident at school, Goyo's mother solved her son's problem by insisting he wear a thick cotton diaper. He hated wearing the diaper because it was so bulky it made his trousers look a strange shape. He was certain his classmates could tell he had it on, although no one actually said anything to him in class, apart from still calling him shit pants over and over again. At home, Goyo didn't dare complain to his mother. She only cared that he got good marks in class and threatened him with punishment if he didn't. Goyo achieved high academic grades at school mainly because he had a high IQ and few distractions at home. Unlike his peers, no one took interest in him once class was over. He spent most of his time alone in the school playground, and most afternoons he'd settle down in the corner of the school library to complete his homework before he left for the day. Therefore, Goyo's teachers were not surprised when he passed all his exams with flying colors. He soon earned himself a reputation as one of the brightest science students of his academic year. The powerful fuel giant, Pemex, awarded Goyo a cash scholarship to cover all his living and academic costs while he trained to be a research scientist. And he also encouraged him to begin developing new products for their company. At 21 years old, Goyo was still living at home with his mother, but many people said that she still treated him like a 10-year-old. Goyo remained the dutiful son by always helping his mother with the housework, and when he began earning a proper salary at Pemex, he gave half of it straight to his mother. Goyo's other brothers and sisters had long since left home, but he felt unable to leave his mother on her own because he knew only too well how vulnerable and lonely she was. Most evenings after work, Goyo would complete his home chores and then devote himself to painting or playing the piano. All the while, he also continued carrying out gruesome experiments on animals. These took place in a shed he had built in the backyard of the family home. Goyo's world revolved around the house and the Pemex laboratory, where he worked in the center of Mexico City. He was painfully shy with girls and awkward with his peers. Keeping busy at home was a useful diversion from the pressure of having to socialize. Despite his sheltered life, and like most young people, Goyo was sexually curious, but he struggled to understand the mere notion of dating girls. In general, he was far too shy and unconfident to approach or speak to them. In the end, though, he was so driven by determination to have a proper relationship that he got enough courage to talk to Sabina Gonzalez Lara, whom he met in a local cafe. Despite being surprised by his sudden request to marry her, Sabina agreed as she liked Goyo. She later said she trusted him because he seemed so gentle, considerate, and thoughtful. In preparation for their marriage, Goyo rented them a plush apartment at 20 Mar del Norte Street in the district of Tacuba, close to his mother's house, and insisted Sabina didn't have to get a job because he would provide for them both. Sabina later said she felt uneasy as soon as they got married because it happened so quickly. However, Goyo continually insisted he was madly in love with her, so Sabina didn't want to disappoint him. But as soon as he returned to work, she found herself in their apartment feeling lonely, deflated and bewildered as to what she was doing there in the first place. She also began noticing that Goyo regularly wet their bed at night. Goyo didn't help matters by refusing to talk about it with Sabina, and as the days turned into weeks, Sabina began to long for a life of freedom. Besides his bladder problems, the apartment had started to feel like a prison. So she began meeting with friends during the daytime, while Goyo was at work. They all told her she was crazy to have gotten married so quickly, and when they heard about her husband's bedwetting, they rolled their eyes in disgust. Less than a month into the marriage, Sabina noticed that her husband had once again wet the bed when she went to make it after he had left to work. It was the final straw. She packed up all her bags and belongings and left. She left him a note explaining that she had fallen in love with another man. It wasn't true, but she needed an excuse to leave him. When Goyo got home and he read the note that evening, he smashed up the apartment in a fit of rage. He later admitted being thankful that Sabina hadn't been there at the time, as he felt like she might have gotten seriously hurt. Following his disastrous short-lived marriage, Goyo began hiring sex workers. But rather than going to brothels and risking somebody seeing him, he found teenage streetwalkers prepared to come to the rented apartment he had once shared with his wife. He preferred them to be under 20 years old because, at that young, impressionable age, he believed they wouldn't humiliate him or treat him like some sort of circus freak because of his disability. He also felt safer if the women were on his territory when they slept together. On one boiling hot day in August of 1942, Goyo, now 24, paid for the services of 16-year-old prostitute Maria de los Angeles Gonzalez, who called herself Bertha and walked the streets of the Tacuba area close to his home. Within minutes of arriving at Goyo's apartment, he became extremely nervous about the prospect of having sex with Bertha, even though he had just initiated the situation. He later said he was confused by his sexual urges because they were so overwhelming that he made decisions he later regretted. But despite his nerves, they eventually managed to start having sex, although Goyo defecated before he achieved an orgasm. Bertha was so disgusted, she screamed and yelled at him to clean it up and refused to help him do so. As Goyo stripped the sheets off the bed, Bertha mockingly accused him of being shit-scared of her and then laughed at her own insensitive joke. Goyo gritted his teeth and tried to ignore her as he dropped the badly soiled sheets in the bath. But Bertha continued humiliating Goyo. She even demanded he pay her the full fee plus a generous tip to compensate for what had happened. Goyo tried to contain his anger towards Bertha with careful breathing exercises he learned from a colleague at work. But as he soaked the soiled sheets in the bath, she continued humiliating him. He eventually got up, slowly walked up behind her, placed his hands around her neck, and squeezed so tightly that she fell unconscious to the floor within seconds. Goyo calmly ripped the cord from the overhanging curtain, straddled her limp body, and wrapped the cord around her neck. Then he began pulling it tighter and tighter until he was certain she was dead. Goyo later recalled that the moment after the killing was the first time in his entire life that he was actually able to achieve sexual satisfaction. Afterwards, Goyo carefully and methodically buried the teenage girl in the back garden of his apartment. Then he headed to his mother's house, as he didn't feel like spending the night alone. Vicenta was delighted to see her son and insisted he share her bed that night. Nothing sexually happened between them, but Goyo later said that as they lay there, he got an erection thinking about how he just ended that young girl's life. Goyo kept thinking about the expression on her face as her bulging eyes virtually popped out of their sockets while he squeezed the life out of her. In his head, he had no doubt that Bertha deserved to die for humiliating him. He would claim in interviews that he wished he'd done the same thing to all those children who laughed and teased him when he defecated in his pants all those years earlier. A few days after the incident, Goyo hired the services of another young prostitute, a 14-year-old girl who was known as Erendira on the streets of Tacuba. He feared that in order to achieve his own sexual climax again, this girl would also most likely have to die. But Goyo managed to convince himself that this time he could achieve what he wanted without having to commit another murder. Goyo became so obsessed with having normal sex with Hernandez that he began sweating profusely as he tried to have sex. When she looked up and saw the way his eyes had glazed over, she started resisting. Infuriated that he was being rejected, he became very tense, which gave him an immense headache. He decided the only way to stop his headache from getting worse was to rape her. Afterwards, Goyo apologized profusely, but the girl accused him of being a creep and demanded her money. She also threatened to tell her brothers what had happened and said that they'd come around and sort him out. Hernandez's words cut through Goyo like a knife as she continued berating him over what had happened. Once again, he tried to breathe slowly and deeply, not wanting to respond, but that didn't work, and eventually he got up, took the same piece of cord from earlier out of a drawer, walked up behind Hernandez. He quickly looped it around her neck and pulled so hard that the cord tore through her flesh. Later that night, Goyo buried teenager Hernandez's body in a shallow grave in the garden alongside Bertha's corpse. Goyo later admitted he knew that killing both women was wrong, but his actions had unleashed a need for sexual satisfaction like no other feeling he had ever experienced. A couple of weeks later, Goyo murdered 16-year-old prostitute Rosa Reyes by also tying the same cord around her neck and strangling her after she refused to have sex with him. Her body was buried in the garden alongside his first two victims. Rosa Reyes' murder was followed 2 weeks later by the killing of yet another 16-year-old sex worker. Again, she was strangled and buried in the garden. A few days later, Goyo approached a prostitute on the street near his home. She later recalled how she was about to go with him when another car showed up alongside them. The prostitute glanced at Goyo and then at the wealthy businessman in his big car and chose the other client instead. The older customer apparently ended up taking her to a weekend getaway, having got not only a holiday out of this, but also avoiding almost certain death. That same woman later described herself as being the luckiest whore in Mexico City. The following day, Goyo was driving down the street in the district of Tacuba when he noticed 21-year-old Graciela Arias Avalos. The difference here was Goyo knew her from when they'd both been chemistry students at the university. Goyo stopped his car, rolled down the window, and asked Graciela to have an ice cream with him. The pair ended up having dinner in a restaurant that evening. Seemingly believing this could be something romantic, when Graciela got into Goyo's car in an empty, badly lit street afterwards, he tried to kiss her. She slapped him in the face to stop him and told him she didn't find him attractive. Goyo later said he was so shocked by her rejection that for a few moments he gripped the steering wheel as tightly as possible to stop himself from attacking her. He stated that she continued lecturing him in the car, so he took one hand off the steering wheel and looked around for a length of cord he kept in the pocket of the driver's door. Still staring ahead from the windshield, Goyo held the cord tightly in one hand and tried once again to resist the temptation to hurt her. It seemed to be working until she announced she no longer wanted a ride home. He took his other hand off the steering wheel and leaned across to where she was sitting and grabbed her by the neck. With one deft movement, he wrapped the cord around her neck and stared intensely into her face, strangling her so tightly that her head almost separated from the rest of her body. Afterwards, Goyo put her corpse in the boot of his car and drove back to his apartment. Later, that same evening, Goyo removed her body from his car and carried it over his shoulder into his apartment, wrapped in a rug. He laid her corpse carefully on his bed, spread her legs apart, and then for the following 4 hours, raped her. When he finished, Goyo buried the remains in the same part of the garden that already contained the corpses of the other women he'd killed. While all of Goyo's previous victims had come from poverty-stricken backgrounds, Graciela's father was a renowned criminal lawyer named Manuel alias Cordova. He had a close relationship with the Mexico City police, as well as the government's public ministry. So within hours of Graciela's disappearance, Senor Cordova put the police under immense pressure to find his missing daughter. More than a dozen police officers began scouring the Tacuba district where she'd last been seen. They eventually came across two witnesses who had seen Graciela get into a car driven by eccentric local scientist Goyo on the afternoon she'd gone missing. Investigators immediately switched their inquiries to the Mar del Norte area of Tacuba, where Goyo lived in the apartment close to his mother's house. None of Goyo's neighbors had seen him that day, but a couple of them told police that they'd grown suspicious of Goyo's noisy late-night garden excavation work. One revealed he'd confronted Goyo about those strange activities as he left for work one morning, but Goyo had brushed off the man's questions by insisting no one had even been in his apartment. Another resident in the apartment block told detectives she'd heard women's screams coming from Goyo's apartment on several occasions over the previous few months. Goyo soon heard about the police inquiries and became convinced it was only a matter of time before detectives came knocking on his door. Believing he was in need of urgent psychiatric help, Goyo committed himself as a voluntary patient into a local sanitarium. It was run by a world-renowned mental health expert named Dr. Gregorio Oneto Parenque. Goyo later claimed he was relieved to have gotten himself off the streets and into treatment, as he knew he had to stop killing any more innocent women. He was examined in the mental health facility by resident psychiatrist Dr. Quiros Cuaron, who concluded that Goyo had an acutely neurotic personality, evolutionary neurosis, organ neurosis, narcissism, and seemed obsessed with anal sadistic eroticism. Dr. Cuaron also insisted on contacting the police to inform them of Goyo's decision to commit himself. Detectives, under immense pressure from the latest victim's well-connected father, assumed Goyo was trying to avoid arrest and spoke to a local judge about getting a warrant for his arrest. The judge issued a warrant after rejecting the mental health expert's prognosis on the basis that Goyo had to be sane because he had graduated with a top-class honors degree. The judge also noted that Goyo showed no external signs of actual insanity. On September 7th, 1942, a heavily armed police unit detained Goyo inside the clinic, and he was taken in a convoy directly to a cell at Mexico City Police Headquarters. Back in the small garden of Goyo's apartment, police uncovered the shallow grave of a teenage girl they presumed to be a missing 16-year-old named Raquel Gonzalez, whose disappearance had been reported to them a few weeks earlier. However, later that same day, Raquel walked into police headquarters to announce she was very much alive and had just run away with her boyfriend, which was why she'd gone missing. It was only many years later that police were able to establish that the first corpse they'd found was that of the young prostitute named Hernandez. Sadly, no one ever claimed her body or reported her disappearance, and after an excavation of the rest of the garden, the other corpses were also found. During a 10-hour interview by detectives at Mexico City Police Headquarters, Goyo admitted to investigators he had not only killed the 4 women whose bodies were buried in his garden, but he also had sex with their corpses. When one of the officers interrogating Goyo asked him why he'd begun killing women in the first place, he explained about his previous marriage and how the relationship broke him when his wife ran off with another man. Goyo told detectives that his wife's adulterous behavior had turned him into a woman hater, and this had directly led him to murdering the women. Goyo also claimed to investigators that he carried out chemical experiments on the corpse of each victim, injecting them with a variety of substances to see how their corpses responded. This later turned out to be a lie. Goyo cleverly wanted to ensure his lawyers gave the impression in court that he was a mad scientist rather than a cold-blooded killer. The press in Mexico City immediately nicknamed Goyo the Strangler of Tacuba, and he was moved from his police station cell to Mexico's largest prison, El Palacio Negro de Lecumberri, to await his trial. Back at Goyo's family home, his sister was devastated by the allegations that her brother was a serial killer. Just a few weeks after his arrest, she died of an acute myocardial infarction, which doctors said was directly related to the stress she had been subjected to. Goyo's trial was heard relatively quickly after he made it clear to investigators that he'd be pleading guilty to all 4 murders he'd been accused of. The judge sentenced Goyo to life in prison. Prison was expected to be a rude awakening for the shy, well-educated, middle-class Goyo, who found himself in jail with some of Mexico's most dangerous killers. Journalists and criminals alike predicted he'd end up being murdered by other inmates in revenge for the way he'd killed those innocent young women. However, most prisoners grew to like Goyo, despite the brutality of his crimes. Goyo showed particular compassion towards inmates who couldn't afford lawyers to prove their innocence. Many of them weren't properly registered in a prison, so their families had no idea they were even locked up. Goyo helped these inmates, many of whom were illiterate, to write letters and contact lawyers to represent them. And this further improved his relationship with many prisoners and staff. He also attended psychiatric sessions and received regular visits from his family. Goyo was allowed to open a store in prison, where he sold sodas and cigarettes. They even trusted him so much that they gave him a day pass to restock for his business and to visit his family. Unfortunately, one December day in 1946, he didn't return. He fled to Oaxaca, hundreds of miles southeast of Mexico City, with a nurse from the prison infirmary. Goyo's escape was seen as a huge embarrassment to the authorities, who kept their decision to give him a day pass a secret. Many claimed he was given special treatment because of his family's connections to powerful Mexican politicians. As police launched a nationwide manhunt for Goyo, several members of the public told the media that Goyo was harmless and that they should leave him alone and not bother sending him back to jail. Others warned that Goyo was a chilling and dangerous psychopath whose crimes were classic examples of gender violence that was typical of that era in Mexico. Some demanding his capture linked Goyo's necrophilia to criminals of the past, including Jack the Ripper and the notorious vampire of Dusseldorf. Serial killers having an obsession with having sex with dead bodies. A little side note, I did a little research and there was no physical evidence that Jack the Ripper raped his victims or had sex with them, but a lot of people believe that he did. So, yes, it's really what you want to believe. Goyo later said he was surprised by the media's response to his escape, and he insisted that he never saw himself as being a danger to the public. When Goyo was captured and returned to prison, he was greeted as a hero from the other inmates because it humiliated the authorities and public officials. This fueled Goyo's bizarre new status as a national treasure who just happened to be a mass murderer. Back in Mexico City, there were several allegations of copycat killers imitating Goyo's homicidal habits, now that he was able to make murder glamorous. There was even a pornographic film made about him, which oddly became a box office hit inside Mexico. While in prison, Goyo wrote 3 books and was regularly psychoanalyzed by the country's top mental experts. They would go on to claim that Goyo was a classic example of a psychopath. Goyo was permitted by prison authorities to study psychiatry and law while inside. In addition, he received a huge amount of fan mail from women who would ask to visit. Some even brought him food and took care of other needs. He eventually married one of his female pen pals and had 4 children with her. Apparently, when the media found out about the conjugal visits, Mexican women's groups accused prison authorities of cheapening the memory of his victims. Although, after Goyo got married, some believed he wasn't as dangerous as the other prisoners he was incarcerated with. For the next 30 years, Goyo proved to be a model citizen, even earning a diploma in criminal law after completing a correspondence training course. Goyo was released in 1976 and pardoned by President Luis Echeverria. He was hailed as a hero and hailed as a great example of a clear case of rehabilitation, and was invited by Interior Secretary Mario Moya Palacia to give a speech in the Congress of the Union. Goyo eventually moved to Los Angeles and died in August of 1999.